said that he was the Wizard of Oz in this letter, and that he was granting us powers that we have that we didn't know we have, which is the moral point of the Wizard of Oz. Did you know the author was a socialist?
Yeah.
Is that known in Russia, the Wizard of Oz?
Oh. Yes, the Wizard of Oz, yeah.
It's a very communistic book. So good. We have something to look forward to next time. And if any of you have fictional or fictionizable efforts, let's see if we can work together and use some of the methods that we developed about putting things in the past tense and so on and so forth, and see what we can do with it.
We shouldn't forget that we have Lola's story also that nobody's mentioned or looked at for a number of months, but she wrote a future history or a utopia that we have the materials for. So we might want to try to get her back in the loop. And
great idea.
Do you know Bogdanov's works?
Bogdanov? I know. I was thinking more of Platonov as a fiction writer. Bogdanov wrote Red Mars, right, or Red Star?
Red Star.
Right.
The first volume is Red Star. The second volume is Engineer Many. And this is very interesting. That the Marxist science fiction utopia. It was published in Russia, and it's quite well known.
Yeah, Mackenzie Wark wrote some chapter or two about Bogdanov in one of his books. I'll look up what he wrote and send it around.
Like Molecular Red or something like that?
Yes, in Molecular Red.
Okay.
I tried to read that and found it not very comprehensible. I don't get it with Mackenzie Wark. I just don't know what he's talking about.
He's an acquired taste, and he's more amusing than he is deep. But the value of what he does is to take a lot of other people that we haven't read and summarize their ideas in his own way, and make that at least pique your interest about what they might have to offer.
Well, that was the problem. My interest in Bogdanov was already piqued. Is there a biography of him in English or French?
I don't think there's very much good material about Bogdanov at all in English.
Well, that's why I went out and spent money on his book, this Mackenzie fellow, and there ain't any, it's soup without anything in it. No vegetables, no meat.
Well, the Wark's style is in some ways, it's kind of charming and journalistic, right? He does offer these sort of concise summaries at times of, different trends within theory and all of this. But yeah, I mean, my observation would be, like Fred, that he's not a serious or deep philosopher, though, an author perhaps of some value for sure.
The substantive work that he's done is more on information technology and hackers and the precarious nature of IT work and then some speculation about the possible alliance between hackers and workers. He wrote a book called The Hacker Manifesto that deals with all that. But he also wrote a couple of books about the situationist movement.
Yeah, it's like digital situationism, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds very interesting, that part. Very interesting. So today we had planned to discuss world revolutions or revolutionary waves of the 80s, of the late 70s and early 80s. And but we're in the middle of one right now, which Fred has just sent around, uh, which is what's happening in Nicaragua. And Fred, I wonder if you would lead us through a discussion of Nicaragua.
Yes, let me finish. I'm just typing a note to myself, and then I will.
Fred was in Nicaragua for the first 2 years of the revolution as a journalist for Impricor, but Victor Serge had already left.
Yeah, we could have used Victor in that situation. Yeah, I arrived in Managua with my comrade Peter Camejo in about July 23rd, 4 days after the victory of the revolution in 1979, and I was there. I was there for the great days of the Nicaraguan Revolution, before the Contra War began, before things got difficult economically. It was the moment of euphoria at the fall of the dictatorship, the beginnings of organization of unions and peasant cooperatives and student organizations and so on, and women's groups that flourished, and the send-off of the literacy campaign, in which brigades of young people took off and went to the countryside and taught the peasants to read and write. And then the sorting out at the level of the state of who was in charge, because the coalition that overthrew Somoza involved large sectors of the liberal, well, in Nicaraguan terms, the Conservative Party, which was actually the more liberal wing of the bourgeoisie, and the bigger agricultural producers and so on. And there was a tug of war in the state over, between them and the Sandinista Liberation Front over who was going to run things. And the Sandinistas came out on top, but in the process, kind of failed in the mission of building power from below, and instead instituted some by the mid 80s had created a bureaucratic apparatus and a pretty authoritarian state, and had allowed a lot of the more self-organized popular initiatives to wither, or they weren't repressed, but they just weren't, no one paid any attention to them, and they didn't flourish, and they didn't become means by which working people could actually govern the situation. And then, of course, the Contra War was launched by the United States, and the conflicts along the border with Honduras, the recruitment of some of the less advanced layers of the peasantry into the Contra effort, and basically a civil war in large parts of the north and east of this country, which bled the revolution and contributed to tremendous economic problems. And of course, this is at the same time that Gorbachev had initiated perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union, and had begun to turn away from whatever aid and support the Soviet Union had been giving to revolutions in the global south, or to nationalist democratic regimes, and was reducing aid to Cuba, and was definitely not interested in taking on another so-called another Cuba in Nicaragua, not interested in confrontation with the Reagan administration over that, and not interested in devoting resources to it. So Nicaragua was, in the Sandinista revolution, were between a rock and a hard place by the late 80s. And it was to their credit that they continued to hold open elections, and they contested an election in 1990, which they actually lost fairly narrowly, but they lost it to this liberal wing of the bourgeoisie behind Violeta Chamorro, who was the widow of a prominent civil libertarian newspaper publisher, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. So they gave up the reins of government, although they retained control over the army and most of the popular institutions like trade unions and peasant cooperatives and so on, student organizations. But they also engineered what became known in Nicaragua as La Piñata, a certain amount of looting of the state's resources for the private benefit of a good number of Sandinista leaders. Nice houses, control over certain companies, investments, number of things like that, because they had nationalized all of Somoza's properties at the time of the revolution. And a lot of those state companies then passed into the hands of individual Sandinistas, in particular the grouping around Daniel Ortega. I don't know in detail the history of the following decades, but when we get to 2016, Ortega has now been a leading figure in Nicaraguan politics for 30 or 40 years and has made all sorts of pretty corrupt deals with the bourgeoisie, with the church, which was a very reactionary force during the revolution. That is the church hierarchy, the archbishop and the various monsignors and bishops, with the exception of certain practitioners of liberation theology like the Cardinal brothers and others. But definitely Ortega and the people around him made their peace with the church. He had the archbishop, who was his archenemy in the 80s, officiate at his wedding with his sidekick and compañera Rosario Murillo, who is now vice president and aspires to be Evita Perón, but at times appears more like Imelda Marcos.
Yay.
And one of the concessions to the church was an outright ban on all abortions, even those that might threaten the woman's life. So it's been a pretty, yet at the same time, I mean, a lot of the gains of the revolution in terms of the land reform and especially, benefits provided by the state to people in terms of welfare benefits, unemployment insurance, health care, those sorts of things have been maintained to some extent and have been kind of used by the regime to foster a clientelistic relationship with sections of the population. A lot of that was enabled by aid from Venezuela when Venezuela was rolling in dough from the oil boom. And the Chavez government was providing assistance to a lot of popular democratic regimes around the continent. That seems to have diminished now, of course, because of Venezuela's crisis. Anyway, one other important issue is the intention or the plan on the part of Ortega's government to invite Chinese capital into the country to construct a sea-level canal across Lake Nicaragua, which is a freshwater lake in the center of the country. And the environmental devastation and the displacement of people in the countryside that would result from this would be quite catastrophic. And there have been quite a large social movement in the countryside among the prospective victims of this to protest it and to demand that it be halted. The Chinese investors seem to have pulled back, and it's not clear whether that's going to go forward. But that was one factor leading to the recent upsurge. And then a second thing was there's a pretty substantial environmental movement among young people in Nicaragua. And in early April, there was a big fire at a nature reserve in the eastern part of the country, which is also a indigenous community. And the government really botched the handling of the fire and neglected to deal with it in time, and it became quite a destructive environmental catastrophe. So there were big student protests in Managua against this, which drew in people from the countryside. And then I guess the straw that broke the camel's back was some reforms, so-called reforms to the pension system, the Social Security, where employee contributions were increased and pensions were cut at the same time. And that triggered a big wave of demonstrations that then were very brutally repressed by the regime. Riot police and groups of supporters of the regime that could be characterized variously as gangs or thugs or unofficial but sanctioned attackers. And about somewhere between 40 and 60 people were killed, 15 or 20 were disappeared, hundreds were arrested, and even though the government withdrew the reforms to the Social Security system pretty quickly, by then they had discredited themselves very badly through this tremendous repression, which really was on the scale of things that we saw during the Somoza regime. And there's posters and placards and chants in the streets of Managua comparing Ortega and Murillo to the Somozas, which is not entirely far-fetched in that they control all sections of the state apparatus. They control substantial parts of the country's economy. They have crony relationships with the other elites, and it's that kind of situation, despite the fact that it still has this leftist facade in some of its rhetoric and some of its international relations, and it's still not a particularly friendly relationship with Washington, although the U.S. has taken notice that Ortega is by no means the Ortega that he was in the 80s, if he even was then. But that's where things stand, and the regime is badly discredited. It has even lost support among sections of what remains of the Sandinista party itself. There's several dissident factions of Sandinistas that still uphold some of the ideas of the revolution, but there's no clear organization or leadership that has yet emerged, and in that kind of vacuum, it looks like the Catholic Church hierarchy and even some of the private enterprise organizations have retained some credibility and have begun efforts to co-opt this movement. So it bears watching, and it's particularly interesting to those of us who were involved in some way with Nicaragua in the 80s and then kind of lost track or lost interest or moved on to other things and didn't pay attention to what was happening. So it's been a scramble to kind of get back on top of the recent history and the situation. So that's my report on Nicaragua for the morning.
Could I ask a question?
Of course.
What is the status of the land ownership? Because when I was there, it seemed to me that the biggest failure of the Sandinistas was to carry out land reform, which is what everybody expects you to do in Latin America. And in many places, the farm people had taken over the land of the big landowners who were up in Miami and who had gone over to the other side. But, and they were demanding or begging for titles to their land. Mm-hmm. And I had the feeling that the government was dragging its heels on that. And where it seemed to me that peasant if they have something to fight for, that is to say they're the owners of that land, they're not going to protest when their sons are drafted.
Right.
But if they don't have the land, they're not going to follow Napoleon or anybody else.
Yeah, and the early efforts on the land were involved in setting up cooperatives and trying to keep a lot of the larger land holdings intact as
Exactly.
efficient production units. But by the mid 80s, they were distributing land titles, and they were holding ceremonies in the countryside, and you know, the FSLN leaders were handing out, you know, giving a land title in one hand and a rifle in the other, you know, trying to you know, recoup from that slowness that you mentioned. Now that in certain ways contributed to further economic problems, because once the peasants had their own land, they were less interested in producing you know, food for the cities. It was kind of same kind of scissors crisis that Trotsky describes in his writings about the problems in the countryside in the early Soviet Union. I know Jason just mentioned on the chat a good article by Louis Project that reviews a lot of that history of the contradictions in the countryside and between the countryside and the city in the period of the revolution. And I think there's been a you know, a falling back from, you know, support for the small peasants and more of a fostering of the large and middle-sized landholders in recent decades. But I don't know a lot of the further details of that history. Alexei.
Yes, a question about the social structure of the population of Nicaragua at the time of the 1979 revolution and today. What was the structure? And how would you describe the social nature of Sandinista movement?
Okay, well, the two are related. There was a large population on the land, which was a mix of smallholders and agricultural laborers, and just, you know, very precarious population on the land. In the cities, there was a pretty large number of public employees. There was some industry, but it was you know, local light industry, light manufacturing. There were large numbers of agricultural laborers on big cotton plantations, and then there were a lot of small holding coffee, medium-sized coffee growers in other parts of the countryside. So it was kind of a you know, a typical relatively underdeveloped country of the global South. And the industry and then there was, you know, there was a financial sector and a real estate sector in the cities, controlled partly by the Somoza family and partly by these opposition capitalists who were, their main beef was that Somoza was squeezing them out of the benefits to be had from access to the state and its resources. So they turned against him particularly in the 70s, and particularly after 1972, there was this devastating earthquake in the capital, Managua, that pretty much reduced the center of the city to ruins. When I arrived there, you know, there were just you know, vacant, ruined buildings in the center of the city that were some occupied by squatters and a lot of them just falling apart. Anyway, the Sandinista National Liberation Front was sought to base itself among the working people, mostly of the countryside. But it divided into three factions in the early to mid 70s, and there was one faction that sought to, and successfully to some extent, establish a base for themselves among the proletariat in Managua and a couple of other cities, Leon, Chinandega, and that was the proletarian tendency. And then there was a group called the Prolonged People's War tendency that aimed to base themselves in the countryside in sort of a Guevarist kind of effort that, you know, did recruit some peasants, but wasn't going anywhere. And then this third tendency that was led by the Ortega brothers that kind of seized the opportunity to confront Somoza militarily. And with military aid from Cuba and from several other sources, was able to put together some substantial armament and recruit both workers in the city, young students, lots of students who went to the countryside to join the FSLN, and forged an army and created a situation of dual power for several weeks in the summer of '79. They controlled the city of Masaya, which was about 20 miles from Managua. They conducted an orderly retreat of their forces from Managua to Masaya, and then proceeded to encircle Managua moving around through the towns and villages to the south, and then finally, routed Somoza and his National Guard. His regime kind of fell apart. The Guard was a corrupt outfit that wasn't created as a fighting force to begin with. It was created as a repressive apparatus, and once it was actually in battles, it proved to be not up to the task. And it was the time of the Carter administration and the human rights policies on the part of the U.S. State Department, and they kind of remained neutral. They didn't jump to the aid of Somoza, although they didn't provide much support to the Sandinistas either. But their hesitations and their qualms about getting back in bed with a Latin American dictatorship at that moment provided a further opening for the Sandinistas. And the other thing the Sandinistas did was very effectively forge a coalition against Somoza, a very broad national front of everything from these liberal bourgeois to the some of the Catholic priests, lawyers, faculty from the universities, students, of course the working people in the city and the countryside. So it was in effect a national democratic revolution that aspired. Many of the Sandinistas aspired to make it a socialist revolution on the Cuban.
I remember that in Soviet Union,
the political situation wouldn't allow that, and they didn't approach it from the standpoint of mobilizing and educating the rank and file of working people in that perspective. They kind of tried to do it behind the backs of the country, which also came back to haunt them. So, Alexei, I'm sorry.
Yes, I remember that in Soviet Union, Nicaragua was characterized as a country of socialist orientation. And the thesis was that it should develop along the path of Cuba, and become another Cuba in Central America. So, as I see, it was a pre-industrialized, agricultural, mostly peasant country with archaic social structure. And the group around Ortega and others tried an attempt of what Tony Cliff called a deflected permanent revolution. Would you agree with that? So the nucleus of the new ruling class, in order to develop along the lines of Soviet Union and Cuba and create a new class system, was it so or not? Or it had a democratic potential? What we see now, we see that they just developed into a kind of the new bureaucratic capitalist clique.
I was there too.
It was not even bureaucratic cap. It was not. It never became a state of the same character as Cuba or the Soviet Union. Whether you adhere to Tony Cliff's view or the Fourth International's view, it was neither a deformed workers' state nor a bureaucratic collectivist regime. It reverted to basically to private capitalism with a certain state component. They never eliminated any, except for the actual Somoza family and its its cronies. They didn't eliminate or nationalize any basic industry or means of production. It all remained in the hands of the same private capitalists that had been in all along. Sam had his hand up. Sam.
Yeah, actually, there was an attempt to sort of mobilize the masses in a certain sort of way through a literacy campaign, using Paulo Freire's philosophy of liberatory learning, but this only lasted 1 year.
Right.
Okay. Sandinistas were in power for 10 years, but the literacy campaign only lasted for 1 year.
Yeah, and they didn't.
I just want to add that as a footnote.
Right, and they didn't follow up on the literacy campaign in any way to actually use it as a basis for organization and mobilization. They just, the students went to the countryside. They taught people to read and write. They had a great learning experience, and then they went back to the cities. And a lot of them probably became officials in the Sandinista apparatus of one kind or another. Richard.
Well, it just seemed to me that this is maybe the Tony Cliff type of development is not applicable here, because it's more a classic bourgeois democratic revolution, a liberal, and they certainly didn't go after property. And the characteristic of it was that it was the only such revolution that played by the democratic rules. The elections were free and fair in '84, and when they were voted out in '90, they left. Sure, they lined their pockets, but what regime doesn't? The piñata, And when they got back in power, it was by the same reasons. They made all the compromises with the more conservative wings of the bourgeoisie. And so it's not really a bureaucratic model. There was never, the party was never such a big deal. And it seemed quite different than the Cuban model, for example.
And when they came back in power each time, they won elections. I mean, there's some thinking that the 2016 election, which was the third re-election of Ortega in a row, there may have been some election fraud and stuff, but they have substantial popular support all the way through, because they did provide some benefits to people. So yeah, I mean, they're a clientelistic bourgeois democratic party with a lot of leftist trappings and baggage. But
I remember being shocked by the freedom of the press, because the Chamorro family's paper, sometimes it appeared with holes in the front page when it was outright censored. But in terms of the rhetoric they used and the criticism of the government, no paper I ever saw in the United States ever was that vicious and forthright in criticizing the government.
Yeah, and of course the offspring of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro were running all of the major media outlets. La Prensa was under the control of Pedro Joaquin Jr., and then the editor of Barricada, the Sandinista paper, was edited by Carlos Fernando Chamorro, who is still active as a journalist, as an opposition journalist in Nicaragua. I might just mention that a certain wing of the Sandinistas split off to the left as the Ortega current moved to the right and became bourgeoisified. There was something called the Sandinista Renovation Movement, and then there's a couple of other smaller currents, all of which are led by former Sandinista comandantes. Most of the proletarian tendency wing became the MRS, and they kind of evolved, I think, in more of a social democratic direction, although some of the things I've seen from them recently suggest, that they're definitely behind and supporting the student protests and so on, but they don't. Their influence was never that great. They had a few deputies in Congress and so on. The press has been under attack by the Ortega regime in recent weeks. Several television and radio stations were shut down. There was some press censorship. There were some physical attacks on journalists, and press freedom is not is under attack to some extent now by Ortega, because they didn't want word of what they were doing to become generalized, which it did, in spite of the fact, because of social media and Twitter and Facebook, and at least among the young people in the cities, that became a major means of communication, just as we've seen in other situations.
And as far as this recent protest movement is concerned, the question is how the social structure of Nicaraguan society changed in the course of this 40 years. Industrialization, the beginning of formation of the new social layers, or what? 40 years?
I don't know. I'll circulate this article by Louis Project, which has something about that in it.
About Nicaragua?
What?
Project discusses Nicaragua in this article?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was just for information, he's a former supporter of the Fourth International in the United States, and was heavily involved in the Nicaraguan support movement in the U.S. in the 80s.
Oh,
he ran Technica, which was a network of skilled technicians in computers, engineers, and so on, who traveled to Nicaragua, raised money, contributed equipment, and that sort of thing.
So today it's the mostly urban movement, protest movement. It's not peasant movement.
It's peasants too, because it's these people in the south of the country who are fear this new canal and what it will mean for their livelihoods. They've been very vigorously protesting for months and held marches. They've had marches from the countryside to Managua. They've been repressed, but not by any means entirely. And they sent delegations to the cities during these most recent protests too. So it's a combination of those things.
But the most important developments are in the cities.
Right now, yeah.
Okay. So I think maybe it reflected some change in social structure and the urbanization, industrialization. Even in Russia, you can buy a lot of products made in Nicaragua. Clothes.
Really?
Oh, no kidding.
Yes.
Like what, for instance? Sugar?
Like T-shirts and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, from light manufacturing. Yeah, I think there's been a certain development of a maquiladora, light industry, assembly plants and so on, like we see elsewhere in Central America. But I don't know that much about it. I'm still catching up.
No, this is a support of Marxist thesis that the political movement would be the necessary result of social developments.
Right.
What is happening in Nicaragua now?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed in the summary of an article that Fred sent around just before we started was that there was no mention in it of anything about the workers in the maquiladoras or elsewhere, and that it was really very focused on the kind of studenty kinds of concerns of one kind or another, where kind of classless. It, talked about corruption. It talked about, the end of repression. It was remarkably similar to much of what you could read coming out of Tahrir Square or the Maidan movement in Ukraine, or these other recent movements. Some of which at certain point did develop certain connections to working class people, and But that was the result of more prolonged struggle than there's been so far. But, I don't know if that's an accurate reflection or just the article Fred happened to summarize for us. I haven't seen it in anything else I've read.
Seen what in particular, Sam? I'm sorry.
Oh, the kind of classlessness.
Oh, right.
Of the demands and, analysis.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. I think there's several different trade union formations in Nicaragua, none of which are that strong. And the main one is still controlled by the Sandinistas around and Ortega. So, like I said, there's a lot of clientelism and dependency on the state for benefits and privileges and so on. So I don't know. I mean, the question, the big question hanging over all of this is where do these movements go in countries that are small and lack substantial resources and substantial economic development? Any country from the scale and character of Nicaragua all the way through to Greece, the ones that are, they're all caught up in a global capitalist system that is oppressive and exploitative and is, any one country, there's a limit to how far a movement can proceed and succeed, I would think, which doesn't mean that we don't welcome, support, celebrate masses in motion and people demanding their rights and demanding economic justice and so on. But it gets complicated fast in any of these countries. Which brings us back to Richard's point that the revolution must be global if it's going to succeed at all.
But global's got to start someplace.
Yes, of course.
And one never knows where the spark is. I think the corollary to that, which is somewhat idealistic, is the inverse. That unless it spreads, it can be isolated, it can be put down, it could just flicker out for lack of support.
Yeah, in the 80s, I mean, the whole, can I make one single point and then something happened to my mic. I didn't do anything. Somebody else put something on. We're getting a feedback or an echo. In the 80s, the expectation and the hope of the Sandinistas and the people in Nicaragua was that the revolutions that were underway in El Salvador and Guatemala would succeed, and that there'd be an opportunity for a confederation of some sort in Central America with some more, power and scope and cooperation, which in turn could have spilled over into Chiapas in Mexico and so on. Well, that didn't happen, and that was the main aim of besides crushing the Sandinistas, the Reagan administration, devoted huge resources to the brutal forces in Guatemala and El Salvador at the same time, and squelched the whole Central American revolution.
Along the lines of what Richard was saying, I think it is important to remember that in a crucial sense, no revolution is eligible to kind of spontaneously materialize at a global level. It seems to me that if we look at the trajectory of revolutions throughout, modern history, what we see is that, to a certain extent, and in their own time, they almost all fail, right? If you look at the American Revolution, you have several decades of, economic stagnation, because of the inability to do commerce with England. The French Revolution, right, the sort of anarchic catastrophes in France, the reparations imposed in Haiti after the Haitian Revolution, Stalinism, all this. But it seems kind of inevitable and characteristic of the development of revolutions that they, in failing, their influence becomes diffused, right? And then incrementally becomes more and more part of our global culture. But, I do think it is important to remember that to expect a kind of global revolution to simply materialize in a fairly spontaneous way. I think almost a kind of messianism. I don't think there's any precedent.
Yeah. Oh, am I feedbacking too? Oh, good. I'm not. One thing that really does need to be developed with greater seriousness than we've seen so far is some sort of alternative to the utopia of money. Okay, this is the way I've been describing capitalism, that the capitalist system is a utopia of money. Okay, that it promises these utopian benefits, or at least piggybacks on utopian benefits that were promised in the development of various technologies, most explicitly the development of electrification in the 1880s, and that it's it just seems likely that in the absence of any sort of obvious alternative to the utopia of money, that a lot of these national revolutions, right, and Marx called for a global revolution, but and that many of these national revolutions would end up being handicapped by their the country's integration into the global system, by the internal politics of the revolution itself, and so on, and that they would quote unquote fail. Well, let's stop for a second to realize what the capitalist system is, that the capitalist system integrates everything in its path in order to appropriate and to capitalize everything in its path. This is the way the system works. One thing we may be waiting for in this regard is a collapse of the capitalist system. Okay, and that before that collapse, we may have to just stick with the small scale, with the Zapatistas, for instance, and we may have to sort of solidify the gains made in those small scales. So I'm just blathering at this point. Go ahead.
You're right.
I said,
Sam, I think, no, go ahead, Richard. What?
All I just said was well blathered. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, the reading that was suggested for this week, and that circles around 1979, is Katsia Fikas's article on the Eros effect and on the Southeast Asian revolutions. And I think those are a whole bunch of examples of what he calls the Eros effect, that is to say, the spark of revolution, the inspiration of it, the feeling in the air, and which may also be a reaction to objective circumstances in the world economy, so that you get these waves of revolution. But in the Southeast Asia model that he puts forward, they're to a certain extent separated by time. It's spread over a decade. And the geography is, I think, different than the geography of, let's say, Europe or even Latin America. I don't know exactly what I'm saying, but the culture of the Philippines, it's an island, okay? What's happening in Korea could or should influence Japan back and forth, but really doesn't because of the hostility there. And then, so what I'm seeing is a kind of a virtual, call it emotional if it's the Eros effect, movement that never stops. And as he points out, because people always and ever want to be free. But I don't see it pulling together, at least not until this era, when it could happen with social media. I think that's really the difference. We got a glimpse of it in 2011, but obviously it's got to go a lot farther than it did then. And then the internet needs to be appropriated and used for organization. And that's not what was happening in 2011. When I say appropriated and used, yes, it was appropriated in many ways. It was used for many things. I mean, specifically for organization, and specifically in the ways that the teachers in the red states have been showing for the last few months. That seems to me, it seems isolated, and it's in the middle of a whole big empire country over there where some of you are. But using Facebook, and I'm sure there are better platforms for it, and I see them coming out, including things that use blockchain, where you've got a certain amount of privacy and where you can't change your mind in the middle of lying. You know what I'm saying? So I think these things are possible. I guess I'm not as pessimistic as I was last week.
Pessimism comes and goes. I heard somebody, I went to an event on the 200th anniversary of Marx last night, and one of the speakers quoted Rosa Luxemburg saying, "Pessimism is a luxury of those who have plenty to eat."
Uh-huh.
You know, the fight for the freedom of the web, of the internet, is now becoming the important front of revolutionary progressive struggles. What is happening in Russia now is the situation around the Telegram messenger. Do you know this? Telegram messenger.
Please explain it.
Yes, Telegram messenger developed by one Russian person, Pavel Durov, who immigrated from Putin's Russia abroad. But this is very popular messenger, not only in Russia but also in Iran. In Iran, about 70% of people with internet use it as a primary messenger. And in both countries, the authorities are waging a war against Telegram because Durov rejected the demand from the police to give possibility to ex-KGB, now it's FSB in Russia, to control messengers. And the response from the state was to block messenger Telegram. And they tried to block it, but then something very unprecedented happened. That they blocked Google, they blocked Amazon, they blocked millions of IP addresses. They even eventually blocked their own website, but they could not block Telegram. And this is the most popular subject of jokes now in Russia. And their big meetings, big rallies are being held in cities under the slogan, the free internet, free internet. Yesterday, there was a mass meetings and protests in about 100 Russian cities, including Moscow and Petersburg, and about 2,000 people were arrested. And one of the most important slogans was exactly this: stop censoring internet. Because people understand it's the realm of their freedom, it's the realm where we can make horizontal links, and they don't want government to control this. And I think in Iran is the same. So it's very important front.
Wow.
That's wonderful.
If you could circulate anything that might exist in English on that, that would be great to get more details about. That's very important. And that's, I think it's unprecedented. I can't think of any other cases where there have been mass protests in the streets over restrictions on the internet. Most such protests take place within the confines of the internet itself, which is their weakness. So, very good.
No, I
And
knew
also,
something was happening. I joined Telegram yesterday, and somebody was circulating something for groups like ours about having blogs on Telegram or something, but I didn't quite understand it.
I never heard it until just now.
I know that it's encrypted, which is good for openers.
yes, this is encrypted, and the Telegram designers, they refuse to give keys for this encryption to the authorities.
Yeah, that's a breakthrough that the, with the full strength and power of the Russian technical apparatus was unable to block it.
Yes.
That suggests that it's very robust and, not too vulnerable to attack and surveillance.
It literally demonstrates the impossibility for ruling groups to control the internet, technically.
Apparently, yeah.
That's
Without applying brute force and shutting down essential services of their own.
Because the central services are abroad. It's a global society.
Right.
Well, because this is interesting if you compare the standoff between Putin and Telegram with the standoff between Apple and the United States government, where they too didn't want to give them the codes for perfectly comprehensible capitalist reasons. That's one of their selling points. But apparently, the US government has more power over Apple than Putin has over Telegram, because the Russian that invented it moved to the United States, which proves that the internet is international and can survive in Iceland, or all it needs is someplace like that.
Yeah. Is Telegram a private business, or is it a one of these peer-to-peer decentralized open source?
No, it's a private business developed by this Pavel Durov, who positions himself as a libertarian, anarchist, anarcho-capitalist, I think.
Okay.
Well, we can use some of those guys on our side. But I'm trying to, I wish I were able better to visualize what it looks like. How, for example, the teachers in West Virginia, later in the other states, got their shit together using Facebook. Does anyone here know what that looks like? Could you find or send a description of it? Because clearly, it's essential.
Yeah, we need to look for that. I don't know. Jason, do you know much about that?
A little bit, but I've saved articles more than read them. The New York Times article I linked makes the argument that while Facebook was important, it was important in the context of a union that existed. Like that just with Facebook, there's no reason to think that this would have happened. And it gives examples in Wisconsin of like teachers unions that have been able to resist despite the overturning of the collective bargaining agreements. But yeah, so I don't know the details, but I think the New York Times article, I think, is right that Facebook was helpful in the context of like there was already an existing organization that had some power. Yeah, it also took years of work, and that's partly why the West Virginia teachers did better, and arguably than some of the other struggles, because it's been a long process and it's inspired other people, but it's going to take a lot to continue that fight elsewhere.
Yeah, I saw a good description, I think in Labor Notes, of how the West Virginia teachers had been able to set up private Facebook groups, whatever that means,
Right.
within schools and within counties and stuff, and use that as the basis for organizing locally. And then that was done over about a year, and independent of the union pretty much.
So it's basically an organization by cells.
Mm-hmm.
By local groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the Facebook group becomes the cell in a way. I mean, the cell forms and uses Facebook to communicate. It may not, in the first instance, be formed purely on Facebook. It's a combination of face-to-face organizing and communication with use of these new tools that enable people to be in touch with each other without having to go through a central office, a central union bureaucracy or something.
But the earlier example of massive using of Facebook for organizing movement, it was an Arab Spring. And in these events, Facebook manifested itself as a revolutionary tool. That's why, for instance, China regime is blocking Facebook, and quite effectively with the Great Chinese Firewall. And now in Russia also, the regime is talking about the Russian Great Firewall in order to block these social networks completely, including Facebook. Facebook is quite effective instrument.
That's what I'm gathering. My question was really very much about the detail, the formal organomon, is that a word? How people actually organize, how many people in each cell and how they're federated and so on. I think those issues are really interesting.
Well, you can just create a group, and this group can be secret or it can be closed and opened, all kinds of options. And you can include people to add people to this group, and you can communicate without any control. No, maybe only from Zuckerberg.
I'm going to set up a Facebook group and invite you all to join it. It's going to be a closed secret group, and we'll see what we can do there.
No, it's not secret, but closed group, because secret group means it does not show in Facebook at all. And closed group means person cannot just by himself join this group.
Right.
They must be approved by administrator.
Yeah, that's what makes it a closed group. But you can also set the privacy settings so that it appears only to the group itself and not to the general public. Not that we're going to do anything illicit or illegal in this group, of course, but
we might think.
I say that for the benefit of anyone who may be taking notice of our conversations. Sam, Sam, I think you're muted.
I'm not going to join Facebook just to be in your group.
Oh, well, that's a problem then.
Are we discussing Korea today? Or am I just?
We could be. We started to a little bit. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I didn't have. It's just I think
the contemporary developments, the nuclear deal,
Yeah. I didn't necessarily have. Though I do have to say, with respect to Richard's article on Korea, which I read, I questioned some of the judgments set forth in it because you expressed, Richard, in your article that you don't doubt at all that the state of North Korea would be willing to, for example, use atomic weapons, right, against Japan and South Korea and so on. And given how sort of suicidal such an action could potentially be, I was just surprised by that. That sort of psychological description of the regime offered in your text there.
Did I say that? Because I wrote that maybe 8 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, different context. I do appreciate as well. When did Kim When did Kim Jong-un become leader? What year was it? It was 2000.
Well, it was his father before him.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really much matter. It's the same situation. Obviously, if we're going to go to the madman theory, anything is possible, right?
Yeah.
But even Trump hasn't really got the power to send off the atomic bomb. He can only give the order. There is no button on his desk, whether large or small. So got to think of it in terms, yes, of course, as Serge says, in a tyranny, obviously the personality of the tyrant becomes extremely important, increasingly so. But
well, I don't necessarily think, I haven't seen anything from Kim Jong-un to suggest that, that is his intention. I think, whatever one's opinion of the Korean regime, I think that if you look what happened with Gaddafi, for example, there's a very logical reason, right, for why he would have sought to develop something like nuclear weapons, which is simply deterrence, right? I mean, it doesn't require the supplementation of any additional motive.
Well, his actions,
the result, because Trump has now agreed to meet him, which they've never done, I believe, one-on-one, right, with the North Korean leader, almost in the immediate aftermath of him having procured those weapons. So, I mean, you can see and the kind of trade-offs he may be able to obtain. It's probably a smart move, right?
Nuclear weapons are essentially defensive. The only way they work is when they're not used. As soon as they're used, and especially, but I don't think any nuclear war could be contained. But hypothetically, no, because there'd be a retaliation and the war would escalate. But even if with limited nuclear weapons, a country like North Korea or Iran used their weapons, they would be totally obliterated.
Of course, yeah.
Of course, the rest of the world would be also. That's a matter of probability, not of certainty. But I think it's very, very unlikely that a nuclear war can be contained. And what strikes me in terms of the madness of the tyrant is this. It has recently come out, although it maybe already was known, that John F. Kennedy and what was the big Harvard intellectual that was his aide-de-camp during the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was his name?
George Bundy, Dean Rusk, there were a bunch of them.
Galbraith? No.
Bundy, I think.
Okay. In any case, Kennedy made the calculation that there was something like 30 to 60% chance that if he called Khrushchev's bluff, that it would come to atomic war. And he made the decision to take that chance, which would certainly mean nuclear winter with those two big countries, for one reason and one reason only: U.S. prestige. Khrushchev had already agreed to withdraw the missiles, but the agreement was that the U.S. was supposed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey, which is right on Russia's border, just like Cuba is ours. So it seemed like a fair deal, except that Kennedy, who had already planned to close that base and withdraw, the Pentagon had planned it. It was no longer useful or worth keeping open. And Kennedy knew that. But just to save face, he refused to make that promise to Khrushchev and went ahead with the war maneuvers. Now, we also know that the Cuban Missile Crisis has been reviewed on its 50th anniversary by many of the participants who met. And it transpired from that meeting that the order was given on the Russian side for a submarine to fire a missile. And that the submarine commander, whose rank was a rank that we don't have in the West, it was something like sub-captain. He made that decision on his own.
To not.
He's going to pretend it didn't get the order or something.
Yeah, that was in Robert F. Kennedy's 13 Days. He describes that, that overriding of command.
So, in fact, morally speaking, or hypothetically speaking, Kennedy, who was supposedly this wonderful intellectual, action intellectual, is responsible for the destruction of the world, except that some sub-lieutenant or sub-captain happened to have more humanity and common sense than Kennedy. So we see what kind of world we live in.
I just want to add about I quickly yeah, and in the recent film Jackie, they dealt with maybe the what would have been the tendency to view Kennedy's achievements in a negative light were it not for his assassination. But I want to add about Korea. It seems to me with what's really going on, it's very interesting with this whole thing where Trump is attempting to take credit for the arrangements in Korea. I was reading an article, it was absolutely fascinating, and it was about how it was saying that the real reason why North Korea is now disarming is because of sustained pressure from China, who they've been quite singularly dependent on for economic aid for some time now. And China's made clear that they don't want a nuclearized North Korea. But it's interesting because, there was a number of high-profile assassinations that occurred. Kim Jong-un, of course, killed his uncle. He purportedly fed his body to 50 hungry dogs. I don't know. I don't know. This sounds like made up. I don't know. He counted every dog or something. But there's another guy killed with a flamethrower, I believe. And there was Kim Jong-un's brother was tackled by women with a chemical agent at an airport in Malaysia. It seems to me that what we can see here is that China's actually been attempting, because they haven't been totally comfortable with Kim Jong-un, it seems that China's been attempting to actually achieve a change of leadership in their client state. And having failed to do that, I think what we're seeing now is the normalization of relations between China and North Korea on the condition that North Korea will relinquish its nuclear weapons and actually begin a process of bringing itself into the creation of a larger trade region that we can see with the Silk Road projects, right? The idea of getting this agreement that goes from Vladivostok to Korea to Shanghai. But it does seem that Kim Jong-un is now enthusiastically embracing the possibility of wide-ranging economic reform. And I hear even now that they're getting plans ready to construct a train for the two Koreas.
And then from the U.S., a train. I'm interested in the extent to which Trump is in control of his own foreign policy. And he seems to have taken greater control with the destitution of Tillerson and McMaster. So now he's got John Bolton and this Pompeo, neither of whom are known for not being bellicose. They're both bellicose as hell. But at the same time, Trump supposedly ordered plans for at least a partial withdrawal of troops from the Korean Peninsula. Mm-hmm. To actually do that would be a huge turning point in U.S. foreign policy. I think it would be on the same scale as the British withdrawal east of Suez, or west of Suez. Which direction did they go? West of Suez.
I don't think
when was that withdrawal ordered?
After 1956, when the French and British failed in their invasion of Egypt and basically pulled back.
No. I mean, when did Trump? What have you read about him withdrawing troops from Korea? What is this?
It was several days ago. I saw a news headline.
I don't think he was talking about complete withdrawal of the U.S.
He was, but.
Which has been a thorn in the side of the Koreans since the GIs misbehave and with Korean women, and it's a big burden on the country. The Koreans will be glad to see them gone, but they won't all go. They'll keep the naval bases and shit like that. That's not going to happen. And I think that Trump will get the Nobel Prize. And the reason he'll get it is that Moon and Kim are both of them 10 times smarter than
Yes.
Trump. And they're both Koreans in a little country that, thanks to the United States, has been destroyed 2 or 3 times over. The United States.
But also, on the one hand, it's been destroyed 2 or 3 times over, but on the other hand, thanks to the United States, it is a huge flashpoint and player on the global scene. So,
that may not be an advantage to a country. I think they're just very happy to export their cars and their TV sets.
Yeah, but from a geopolitical standpoint, it gives them more leverage because they're, if there is actually a truce or peace between the 2 Koreas, then why the hell do they need U.S. troops there anymore?
Well, of course, and that's exactly what's happening.
Yes.
What these 2 guys have done is that, looking back at the last sunshine policy in Korea, they took too long dancing around each other, and the United States scuttled it. And what these 2 guys are doing is very, very clear. It's facts on the ground. Before Trump can turn around, they've agreed on this, they've agreed on that, they've made gestures, they've done things that they cannot take back and save face, either of them. They have made peace, and they will work out the terms. And they are smart enough to say that it was all Trump's doing. Don't give a shit. North Koreans will know the truth about it, about how arrogant the Americans are, and the North Koreans will believe whatever their dictator tells them to believe. But in any case, I think that's really what's happening, is that they're
Richard, I think we should nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize in Literature. He has the qualification.
You mean for his collected Twitters?
Yeah, he's invented a whole new art form, hasn't he?
He has, and he's also patriarchal and sexist as hell.
Yes. Is there a prize for that?
It's called the Literature Prize. No.
That was called the Presidency of the United States.
No, but there won't be a literature prize this year precisely because there's a sex scandal going on among the judge and juries.
That's why we nominate him.
Right.
Well, let's get back to Korea.
Richard, I'm sorry. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Going back to Caribbean crisis, what is the source of this sensational information that the order to have a missile strike was given and some sub-captain refused to do it? I don't know anything about that.
I believe that's in 13 days, yeah.
Yeah,
Well.
what I know is that Fidel Castro several times asked Khrushchev to hit U.S. by missiles. And Khrushchev said that Comrade Castro is too much nervous. But no, this sensational story about sub-captain who prevented the World War.
I read this, I believe, in the New York Times during the period of when they all gathered, that had the surviving participants 50 years later, to exchange notes and to try and figure out what was happening on both sides.
In 70s, 15 years later.
50 years.
50 years later.
50 years later.
Never heard about that. Maybe other people heard about it, but
Did
it would have
no
been
one read about it? It was a big deal.
I just found several articles about it. I just posted one to the chat. Definitely happened. There was a captain named Vasily Arkhipov, senior officer of a Soviet submarine who averted the outbreak of nuclear conflict during the Cold War, was honored with a new prize 55 years to the day after his heroic actions averted global catastrophe. On 27 October 1962, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov was on board the Soviet submarine B-59 near Cuba when U.S. forces began dropping non-lethal depth charges. When the action was designed to encourage the Soviet submarines to surface, the crew had been incommunicado and were unaware of the intention. They thought they were witnessing the beginning of a Third World War. Trapped on the submarine, blah, 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 two of the vessel's captains. Oh. They had a 10 kiloton nuclear torpedo in their arsenal and had permission to launch it without waiting for approval from Moscow. So they didn't have positive orders to launch it, but they did have authorization to launch it at will without consulting further with Moscow. Two of the senior officers wanted to launch the missile, but this other officer, the hero, resisted and declined and prevented the torpedo from being launched.
Wow.
It's a different story, actually.
Yeah,
it's not
slightly
like he,
different
by
story.
his own will, prevented the war.
Yeah.
And this is
Well,
what, this
in
is
the
what we
military-
depend on to have a revolution. Is there being other people like that?
Exactly.
It's what the whole history depends on.
The problem is here is a kind of psychological, for instance, with the Iran rulers. They can't be judged by simple logic of geopolitics and so on. We should remember that they are religious fanatics. And this is a theocratic regime. And the Ahmadinejad seriously told the United Nations that he has some visions of prophet who said him to do this or to do that. So who can guarantee that they would not receive an order from prophet to use the weapon? What's the reason?
Well,
I
just
think we're
think about President Pence if he ever becomes president.
Exactly.
I think we're at risk here of ascribing too much autonomy and too much madness to a lot of these state actors. I think in most cases, a lot of what we see in the newspapers and in public speeches and so on, there's a certain amount of there's a theatrical element to that is not it's not for real oftentimes. So, you know, I mean, the classic case of that, and the admitted classic case of that, was Nixon and Kissinger, who, you know, actually developed this. They wanted the Vietnamese to think they were crazy and would do anything, when in fact they were coldly calculating the risks and benefits of what they were doing. So
Most
I
homicidal
think-
maniacs think that they are pretending to be crazy.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, that on the other hand is true too. So
as an undergraduate, I took a course from Tom Schelling, who developed that within the rubric of game theory and really laid it out. And he, of course, was one of those Harvard intellectuals that one of you was talking about before, and has been very influential with that. So I'm sure all the leaders know that by now. The trouble is that creates the situation where underlings will obey the orders if they are given, potentially. And, you know, in case of a revolutionary outbreak in any of the major countries or some of the minor ones, I could imagine they're giving the order to nuke the city. And, you know, God only knows what happens at that point.
To nuke their own cities.
Yes. New York.
Well, you know, my feeling is that the people are everywhere, and that nuclear weapons are not an appropriate or effective way of dealing with popular uprisings. But, you know, then we're dealing with craziness that we're talking about of leaders who think that they have to save face. because basically these things happen in crisis situations. But, you know, it does us very little good to speculate about such things. I wanted to get back to Korea
Yeah.
for an important reason. George Katsiafikis has written a marvelous book about Korea. It's the first volume of his hidden histories of hidden revolutions or invisible revolutions of Southeast Asia. And the Korean Revolution goes way, way back. It goes back to the first Japanese incursions and then to the resistance up in at the end of World War II, and all through the period that the United States supported the bloodiest dictatorships and also committed atrocities to maintain the most violent tyrannical rule over South Korea. Really incredible. The Koreans have been able to organize resistance, and the Chengdu uprising, which, as Katsiafikis points out, was like the Paris Commune, except for this one difference, that the communards already had guns, because in France the National Guard, they in that period took their guns home with them and lived among the people and could elect their officers. So they were the ones that actually started the Paris Commune and then turned it over to the hold elections. But in Chengdu, the working people were not armed, and they pulled together all kinds of fantastic maneuvers using trucks, you know, big transport trucks and taxis and all kinds of things, and stood down a brutal corps of paratroops, you know, and were able to control the city. And during a time when crime disappeared and when order reigned, and it's absolutely a remarkable page in revolutionary history. And although they were eventually put down, that revolution has never really been totally put down in Korea and keeps rising up again. So that now the latest dictator was just overthrown. The revolution is there, in a sense, in permanence. And this new government, they knew what they wanted to do, and they knew also how to keep a low profile and go along with the United States in words while preparing something else. So that democracy struggle, it seems to me, if you want to talk about saving the world, it may or may not have been that sub-captain, but it certainly is the Korean working class, which is one of the most advanced and the one that uses the internet to the most advantage, who, by keeping democracy alive, has allowed this to happen, where the two Koreans will come together and there isn't fuck all the United States can do. At least that's how I see it.
I think the real winner here is China. You know, you were mentioning the two Koreas and Trump, but it seems to me, like I said, that the shift instigated by the North Korean leadership now represents a capitulation to China. And frankly, within the context of North Korea subscribing to these sort of multilateral trade agreements China's pursuing, I think that China will be very, very happy to see not just the North Korean regime becoming more subservient to it, but also that, the cooperation between the two Koreas is likely to diminish U.S. influence in the South China Sea. It's quite ironic that Trump is spinning this as a U.S. foreign policy success, because the reality is, I think we can see it's an example of how other powers like Russia and China are simply outmaneuvering the U.S. in certain areas of foreign policy at this time.
Yeah, I think it's both and. I mean, internally in the Koreas,
of course, yeah,
it's a very positive development. But globally or geopolitically in the region, it certainly strengthens China at the expense of the U.S. No question about that.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how it'll affect Japan, and particularly Okinawa, where the U.S. bases have been a thorn in the side for generations.
Yeah, well, if the Koreans are able to press the U.S. to reduce its military presence in Korea, then that will open the way for the Japanese to, and I'm not talking about the Japanese government so much as the Japanese people, to see opportunities to press for U.S. withdrawal there too.
Well, the rationalization for for military buildup in Japan by the United States was also that North Korea was nuclearizing, right?
Absolutely.
In some U.S. policy circles, they'd even discuss nuclearizing Japan, right, in the extreme of engagement in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. So it ramifies through the whole region.
Yeah. Well, it seems to suggest that, and maybe this is inevitable, but we seem to be seeing here, and China has certainly outlined this as their kind of an immediate geopolitical objective rather than, let's say, global domination. But we certainly see that what this represents is the perhaps inevitable augmentation of China's authority, in East Asia, right?
And everywhere else.
Africa, yes.
So getting back one more time to 1979, the other revolution that really changed the world in 1979 was in Iran. And I still think that the Iranian Revolution, like the Korean uprising and the other ones in Asia, is still alive. The Iranian working class is much more advanced, I think, than in many other countries. I think that Iran is a more modern and industrialized country, although it's been blockaded and thwarted. And people have pretty much had it with the Ayatollahs. And to me, it's only a matter of time before something gives there. Certainly the women are showing signs of restlessness, and how this will come about, well, they've already experimented with the internet and with peaceful demonstrations, with strikes and things, and one never knows when such things break out. But to me, that's maybe a revolution that could break the ice and open up something more general.
I think we may be played out for this morning.
Okay.
And I have to run downtown to the second day of this Karl Marx Now symposium at the Goethe Institute, co-sponsored by the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. Quite good last night with speakers from Anwar Sheikh, Ben Kunkel, Ajay Chaudhary, Drusilla Cornell from Rutgers, who I hadn't heard speak before. Anyway, I'm going to take my prerogative and close us out unless anyone else has something to add. Again, the plan for next week next time is to read and evaluate and critique and contribute to a couple of texts that Sam and Richard are going to present to us.
And texts, too.
Add collective writing back on the agenda. So
back on the agenda.
You stay tuned.
2 questions just about Korea that I just want to put out there, and maybe we can just, things to think about. The first is, and I just raised this briefly, again, there was these sort of purges initiated by Kim Jong-un. I don't know, but reading the events, it seems to me, and I just think this is interesting, that China was actually trying to manipulate agents within the North Korean government to organize a coup shortly after Kim Jong-un took power, to try to push North Korea more in the direction of a Chinese kind of socialism with Chinese characteristics kind of state. The second point is just that while ostensibly the recent talks between North and South Korea have been done in the name of pursuing a long-term plan towards an integrated Korean peninsula, even if relations do cool, to what extent will China ever be comfortable having a Korea with, say, strong relations to the United States directly on its doorstep? Maybe never, right? So it's not, while this may signal peace between the 2 Koreas, it may also not signal the imminent integration of the peninsula because of the delicate geopolitical situation there.
Yeah, and then there's also the pros and cons for China of a unified, economically integrated Korea, which would be a much stronger, in the long run, a much stronger power than the divided Korea is today, even though South Korea itself is still a substantial economic power. So, there could be benefits, but there also could be drawbacks from the Chinese standpoint to that. So,
well, my sense is that they'd be quite willing to and I say this strictly in a kind of economic sense, empower the North Korean leadership, but under the condition that North Korea maintain a regime structure that resembles like post-Deng China, right? So kind of single-party state capitalist arrangement. I think that if we're to risk being overtly democratized, I think they could view that as a jeopardization of their security.
Bye-bye, everybody. Say happy birthday to Karl Marx for us, Fred.
Okay, let's all celebrate.
Okay, see you guys.
See you next time.
Fred, you have beautiful cats.
Oh, thank you. Sasha and Willow. I'll feature them next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.